Hello all, welcome to Narayana IAS Academy. This is Sureka Bhaskar presenting to you the daily news analysis. So in today's discussion, we'll discuss a number of topics taken from The Hindu and the Indian Express, which are relevant from the UPSC CSE examination. So let's look into the topics. So the first topic for today will be defining terror to death for lynching. That is the recent passage of the three criminal law bills in the Lok Sabha in order to overhaul India's criminal justice system will be discussed here. The next one is what causes the inflation in India. This article actually talks about the recent RBI report, and here we'll be dealing with the concept of inflation causes and the measures to control inflation. Moving on, we'll talk about the LRS outflows dropped by 37.68%, where we'll talk about the liberalized remittance scheme and the tax slab, which has been increased by the government from the previous 5% to 20%. Then we will discuss about the recent cholera outbreak in Rourkela, Odisha. We'll discuss about the disease as it holds good value and important from the exam perspective. Moving on, we will discuss about the climate action needs an updated lexicon, that is nothing but general climate action, which talks about a term called a shifting baseline syndrome. The first news for today will be defining terror to death for lynching, Lok Sabha nod for three bills on new criminal laws. So in this particular discussion, we will be talking about the recent passage of the three criminal law bills in the Lok Sabha that aspires to overhaul the Indian criminal justice system. So this particular news is relevant from GS paper 2, government policies and interventions, and also Indian constitution historical underpinnings. And we will take up the new criminal bills, the laws that this particular bill has repealed, the new provisions, as well as the Indian criminal justice system and what is the need for reforming the same. Moving ahead, we have a previous year question. In 2017, there was a mains question asked on mob violence. This particular news becomes important because one of the bills that was actually passed in the Lok Sabha, that is the Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita bill, actually has provisions of mob lynching. So thereby, mob violence becomes an important topic of discussion. Moving ahead, let's look into the news. The Lok Sabha has recently passed three bills that seek to overhaul India's criminal justice system. And let's look into what are the three bills and what are the laws or the regulations it's going to replace. The first bill is nothing but Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita Bill 2023 that will replace the Indian Penal Code. Indian Penal Code was a 19th century regulation which was nothing but the official criminal code of India that was drafted in 1860. Moving ahead, the next bill was Bharatiya Nagrik Suraksha Sanhita Bill 2023. This will be replacing the Code of Criminal Procedure of 1973, that is nothing but a code that provides for the administering criminal law in India. Moving ahead, the next one is the Bharatiya Sakshya Bill 2023, which will be replacing the Indian Evidence Act of 1872 that pertains to governing the admissibility of evidence in the Indian judiciary. So now let us look into why there is a need to reform India's criminal justice system. So first of all, the rules or the regulations we have in place today, first they are colonial era laws. Next, they were patriarchal in nature. Also were inclined to the British policy of class-based systems, profit-minded capitalism, and also did not cater to new realms of crimes. So the laws that are in place today, that is the Indian Penal Code, the Code of Criminal Procedure, as well as the Indian Evidence Act, were colonial era rules and regulations that were patriarchal in nature, that were inclined to the policy of class-based systems and profit-minded capitalism. As we know, the Britishers were perpetuators of capitalism, and also it did not cater to new realms of crime. So moving forward, we will look into the other needs for reforming India's criminal justice system. Moving on to the next point, we see that the current laws are based on colonial era principles and they do not reflect the modern Indian society's reality as well as aspirations. One of best such examples are section 377 of the Indian Penal Code. This particular section of the Indian Penal Code that criminalized gay sex was recently decriminalized by the Supreme Court. Moving forward, we see that these rules were complex and ambiguous that were leading to unnecessary delay and inefficiencies, and the injustices were there in delivering justice. For example, you know that the Nirbhaya gang rape case actually took 7 years to arrive at a final verdict. Moving forward, we see that the realm of crime is constantly evolving. Example, in today's expanding cyberspace, we have increasing cyber crimes, but the laws actually remained intact without catering to the emerging realms of change. Moving ahead, we see that these laws have a huge misalignment with the basic and the most important constitutional virtues of equality, dignity, and human rights. For example, sedition law, that is section 124A of the IPC, has been criticized for stifling the freedom of speech and expression. Moving ahead, we see that there are a lot of pendency of cases. If we see the NCRB report, it notes that there are 4.7 crore cases which are pending as of 2022. Also, the same NCRB notes that around 75.8% of India's prison population were under trials. Thereby, these particular laws did not cater to the releasing of the under trials, leading to unconvicted prisoners who are held in custody while their crime is still under investigation and inquiry. Then we see there are a lot of cases of human rights violation that have been observed, where there are instances of custodial torture, extrajudicial killings, as well as false arrest and unfair trials. If you are aware, in 2010, there were Benix as well as Jairaj case in the state of Tamil Nadu. Now let us look into the key provisions of these bills. The first one is the Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita Bill. It actually talks about cruelty against women, where it defines cruelty by husbands and relatives, and it includes punishment with up to 3 years in jail. Then it has changed the term for mental illness, where it has included terms as unsoundness of mind and also adds intellectual disability in all the relevant sections. Also, mob lynching, as we discussed earlier, it penalized this at par with that of murder. There is a particular provision on publishing the court proceedings where it says that without permission, any kind of publishing the court proceedings with respect to the rape as well as sexual assault will invite you a term of 2 years of jail. And next, it adopts the definition of terrorism from Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. So these are some of the major provisions of the newly introduced Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita Bill. Moving forward, we have the Bharatiya Nagrik Suraksha Sanhita Bill of 2023, where it says that any kind of minor offense you commit, you can compensate it with the community service. And also it deals with the audio visual court proceedings. This provision was recently introduced. And then we have a provision which talks about extended police powers. That is, it says that you can use handcuffs not only in case of heinous crimes or any kind of civil crimes, but also economic crimes. Like economic offenses can also be handcuffed. Next one, it talks about the preventive detention. So talking about this particular term, it's also important to understand what are the different kinds of detentions that you need to study from the exam perspective. One is punitive detention, next one is preventive detention. So this particular bill has a provision of preventive detention, that it ensures the production of the person before the magistrate or release within 24 hours of time in order to prevent the abuse of power by the police. Next talks about the custody. It extends the time of custody beyond 15 days up to 60 to 90 days. The next one is the Bharatiya Saksha Bill 2023. It has a provision regarding the admissibility of electronic evidence in place of or with addition to that of the paper records. So now let us look into the concerns with respect to these bills that have been recently passed. The first one is that it has extended the police custody duration from over 15 days to almost 60 to 90 days is a cause of concern. That is what they say, that concerns over extended police custody durations, it can enable police torture, as we saw in the Tamil Nadu case. Next one is the broad definition of terrorism has been adopted from UAPA, and in many instances it can actually be misused. Next one is there has been a hasty passage of the bills without adequate public consultation and discussion. So this raises serious questions on the transparency and the responsiveness of the legislative process. So it is very important to see to that the criminal justice system of the India is reformed. At the same time, it keeps up to the international standards. For example, Denmark has the best criminal justice system so far in terms of rule of law, in terms of judicial efficiency, in terms of human rights, in terms of access to legal aid, prison system, legal reforms, etc. The next topic that we'll be discussing about is what causes inflation in India, whether it is the demand or the supply issues. So in this particular article, we'll be discussing about the concept of inflation. What are the factors affecting inflation? Whether it is the demand side factors or whether it is the supply side factors. What are the concept of consumer price index and wholesale price index? And what are the measures taken to control inflation? So this article becomes important from GS paper 3 mains economy, and also for prelims this particular topic and concepts of inflation and types become important. So we have a previous year question in 2019 where the question was the view that steady GDP growth and low inflation have left the Indian economy in a good shape or not. So here GDP growth as well as inflation becomes very important for the exam. Moving forward, so recently, the Reserve Bank of India has released a report, that is the December Bulletin, and this actually has taken predominantly the data from the CMIE, that is the Center for Monitoring Indian Economy's Consumer Expenditure. So before moving on to the topic, let us understand the concept of inflation and the factors associated with it. So what do you mean by inflation? Inflation is the gradual increase in the general price of goods in an economy. And inflation, or this gradual rise in the price of goods in an economy, happens due to two kinds of factors. One is the demand side factors, which include money supply, consumer spending, government spending, interest rates, etc. Whereas your supply side factors include production costs, input costs. Apart from production cost and input cost, it also includes factors like agricultural output and supply shocks. So basically, inflation is a gradual increase in the general price of the goods in an economy, and that is actually affected by a number of factors, that is the demand side and the supply side factors. Now let us look into the observations of this particular report. The report observes that inflation in India is primarily influenced by the supply side factors, which is nothing but we discussed about the agricultural output, we discussed about the supply shocks, and we discussed about the production costs. And also, it says that apart from the influence of the supply side factors, the demand side factors also play a significant role in deciding the inflation. Now looking at the COVID-induced inflation, where the report actually talks about the post-COVID period of 2020 to 2023. If we see from January 2019 to 2023, we see the food items and the categories such as vegetables, oils and fats, milks, eggs, pulses and sugar have frequently experienced supply side constraints, and items like non-alcoholic beverages and the personal care products and health related goods were mainly affected by demand side factors. Also, if we assess the subgroup level assessment in the CPI basket, then we observe that from October 2019 to 2020, due to excessive rainfall, there have been supply disruptions which further caused inflation. Also, during the pandemic, there were restrictions that again caused the supply chain issues and thereby increasing the price of goods. Moving forward, if we look into the Russia-Ukraine conflict, this has also caused supply shortages all around the world and also caused a sharp increase in the commodity prices. So here we need to understand what is CPI and WPI. CPI is nothing but it is the consumer price index, which takes into account both goods and services to measure inflation, and the base period is 2012. Whereas WPI is nothing but it is the wholesale price index, which takes into account only goods, and the base year is 2011-12. So this is the basic difference between the CPI and the WPI, and in India we use CPI as an indicative measure in order to measure inflation. Moving ahead, we see that supply side factors accounted for almost 55% of the CPI headline inflation from January 2019 to May 2023. Now let us look into the impact of demand side factors on headline inflation. During COVID crisis, the demand has dropped to about 27.1% in 2020 from 42% in 2019. Also, during the post-COVID-19, where the restrictions were eased, we can actually find that the significance of the demand has actually increased. And also, during the Russia-Ukraine conflict, there were demand-side factors that actually increased. Moving on, when we see from January 2019 to 2023, the contribution of demand drivers to inflation stood at 31%. So here, let us look into what is food inflation and why do we consider it sticky? So we know that food inflation is nothing but general increase in food items or commodity. So why do we call that this is sticky? Because there is an inelastic demand, which is nothing but food being an essential. What happens even when the price increases, the demand always tends to stay high. And also, any kind of immediate policy adjustment would not bring any kind of changes to the food demand. Now, the supply chains in India is always complex. That is, there are multiple stages with various price setting powers. And hence, the policy changes here again has a very minimal impact. Now, let us look into the demand side factors as we already discussed. Money supply is one of the demand side factors because when there is an increase in the money supply in the economy, obviously the demand for a product will increase and the price will also increase. Whereas the decrease in the money supply will decrease the inflation. Next one, if the government spending is high, that is, if the government follows the expansionary monetary policy, the flow of money in the economy increases, thereby inflation increases. Next one is interest rates. Increase in interest rates could reduce the inflation and decrease in the interest rates could increase inflation thereby. And also, as we discuss the supply side factors, they include the production cost, the import prices, the supply shocks, and the agriculture output. So coming on to the production cost, here increase in the cost of raw materials plus wages, etc. will result in an increase in the final product, thereby causing inflation. Next one, if we discuss about the import prices, if cost of imports increases, then the final product also becomes costly, thereby causing inflation. And also supply shocks during catastrophe like cyclones and wars. There is huge supply shocks and there are disruptions in the supply chains. Thereby, this also leads to increase in the price of commodity, thereby causing inflation. Finally, is your agriculture output. Any kind of change in the agriculture output due to the weather and the climatic conditions will affect the food supply and also affects the price, which will fluctuate, resulting in inflation. So the next news that we will be discussing about will be the LRS outflows drop by 37.68% in October after higher tax levy. So this news is nothing but the government has increased the rate of tax deducted at source to 20% from the earlier 5% on all the remittance amount above rupees 7 lakhs. So here we will be discussing about the liberalized remittance scheme. So we'll be discussing about what are remittances, what is the significance of remittances, the top sources or source country for India in terms of remittance, and we will discuss about the liberalized remittance scheme. So this particular topic becomes relevant from the GS Prelims Economic and Social Development, and as I told you, we'll be discussing about the LR scheme as well as the remittances. So moving forward, if we look at a previous year question, there was a previous year question on India's foreign exchange reserves. So economy is an important topic which covers particular schemes and the associated terms that are also covered under the scheme. So moving into the news, we will see that the liberalized remittance scheme outflows have decreased by 37.68% after a higher tax levy from the month of October. As we already discussed, before the month of October, whatever funds were actually transferred overseas under this particular scheme attracted a 5% tax collection at source on amounts that exceeded above 7 lakhs. So, however, from October 1, the tax collection at source rate on the spending above 7 lakh was increased to 20% from the earlier 5%. So here it is important to understand what is this tax collection at source. The tax collection at source is nothing but it is a portion of remittance amount collected by the sender bank and directly deposited with the government as an advanced tax payment. So this particular tax collection at source, which is nothing but a portion of remittance amount which is collected by the sender bank, gets deposited with the government as an advance tax payment. So this particular TCS was increased from 5% to 20% in the month of October. So following this measure, we see the remittance outflow under the LRS scheme has actually decreased by 37%. So let us look into the concept of remittances. So what are remittances? They refer to the transfer of money by the foreign workers to their home country, typically to support the family for various reasons or for various investment purposes. So let's look into the significance. Remittances are a vital source of income for many Indian families, and they contribute to the country's foreign exchange reserves and they support economic stability. Also, if you see in case of India, we have seen the highest amount of remittances inflows in the world in the year 2023 at around USD $125 billion according to a recent statistics by the World Bank. If you see the sources of remittances to India, remittances in India come from Indian diaspora working abroad, and the countries include Middle East, North America, Europe and other regions. And if we see, the topmost source of remittances that India receives is from the United States of America, followed by the UAE, UK and Singapore. Now let's move on to the concept of liberalized remittance scheme. Let us look into the provisions of the scheme. So it is nothing but a scheme which was introduced by the Reserve Bank of India, which allows the resident individuals to remit or to transfer a certain amount of money abroad for various purposes without seeking the prior approval of the RBI. It facilitates legal and simplified remittances for activities, and the activities include travel, it can be education, medical treatment, investment in foreign securities, and maintenance of close relatives abroad. The LRS actually has an annual limit, which is nothing but 2,50,000 USD. This is the maximum amount that an individual can remit in a financial year without requiring special permissions. So the next article that we will be discussing about is 6 dead, 1,000 infected in suspected cholera outbreak in Rourkela, Odisha. So here cholera is very important, as well as other diseases like the Zika, dengue, all the other things which are in the outbreak are important for the exam. And this becomes relevant from prelims general science and mains GS paper 2 issues relating to development in the social sector and services relating to health. So moving ahead, there was a previous year question on Zika virus. So as I told you, diseases become very important as a part of general science. So let's move into the news. There has been a recent outbreak of cholera in Rourkela, Odisha. So let us learn about the disease. This is nothing but an acute diarrheal disease which is characterized by severe diarrhea and rapid dehydration, and it is caused by bacterium Vibrio cholerae. So as I told you, it is due to the ingestion of food or water contaminated with bacterium Vibrio cholerae. And you have different strains to this bacterium, namely O1 and O139, where O1 is responsible for majority of the recent outbreaks, and it has several subtypes, and that actually each has different level of virulence. If you compare 139 to 01, we will see that this is less prevalent than 01 but can still cause significant outbreaks. Moving on, if we see the global cholera burden, we can see that it is estimated to around 1.3 to 4 million cases and around 21,000 to 1.4 lakh deaths annually. Moreover, let's look into the symptoms of this particular disease. It is characterized by severe vomiting, low blood pressure, followed by diarrhea. We have rapid weight loss, increased thirst, and also loss of skin elasticity. So how is cholera transmitted? The transmission is due to lack of safe drinking water as well as inadequate sanitation facilities and poor hygiene practices. Also, let's look into the prevention and control of this disease. First one is hygiene. Promoting good hygienic practices like washing hands and safe food preparation and also proper disposal of human waste or feces is very important in order to curb or prevent the spread of the disease. And treatment includes prompt treatment with oral rehydration solution is effective in most of the cases. And we also have WHO pre-qualified vaccines like the Dukoral as well as the UV-Col Plus. So moving forward, let us look into few of the WHO initiatives in order to control the spread of the disease cholera. So here we have the Global Task Force on Cholera. This is nothing but it leads the global effort to control cholera. It supports the countries in implementing the control strategies and it monitors the progress and also advocates for resources. Now we have Ending Cholera, a roadmap to 2030. This is nothing but it is a global strategy which aims to eliminate 90% of the disease by 2030. Followed by this, we have the WASH initiative, that is water sanitation and hygiene. That includes practices like hand washing and safe water as well as sanitation, which can prevent the further spread of this disease. The next article that we will be discussing about will be Climate Action Needs an Updated Lexicon, where the author discusses about a concept of shifting baseline syndrome. So this particular topic is important and relevant from GS paper 3, environmental pollution and degradation, and also the concept of climate change from prelims point of view. So here we will be discussing about this particular concept with good illustrations. So moving ahead, this particular article discusses the shifting baseline syndrome within the context of climate change and extreme weather events. We know that there have been a lot of recent incidences of extreme climate events and weather catastrophes which are actually taking place. So in that light, let us discuss about this particular concept. So before moving into the concept, let us understand this particular term with the example. So let us consider this particular ocean ecosystem with its biodiversity of differing periods. So this was the ocean ecosystem with its biodiversity and different species in the 1800s, and this of 1950, and this is 2019. So whatever we witness here, that is the 2019 condition of this ecosystem is what we consider to be normal. So when this normal condition of the present ecosystem actually deteriorates, this is what triggers us to take future climatic actions or any action against the pollution. So similarly, if the future generation witness the same ecosystem with a differing level of biodiversity in the 2050, they would consider that to be the normal. This is because we lack knowledge or the information about the past conditions of this particular natural environment. So this particular concept of new normal and shifting the baseline of the new normal is called as shifting baseline syndrome. So now let us go into the definition of this concept. Shifting baseline syndrome is nothing but a gradual change in the accepted norms of the condition of the natural environment due to a lack of experience, memory, or knowledge of its past condition. This we have actually seen in the illustration of the ocean ecosystem with its varying biodiversity. Moving on, in the context of climate change, what is this shifting baseline syndrome is that it is that we gradually adjust our definition of normal, and we perceive the present condition to be the normal environmental condition as they slowly deteriorate. So this can make it very difficult in order to recognize the long-term repercussions or the effect of climate change, and we will underestimate the extent of the problem. So moving forward, we looked at this illustration of shifting baseline syndrome when compared to 1800s and the present 2019 levels of the ocean ecosystem. And now let us actually look into how it applies or how this particular concept applies to climate change. The first thing is let us consider temperature. So we consider the increased or the already increased temperature is the normal. However, if you see increasing global temperature as the new normal, it underestimates the warming consequences. The same thing applies to sea level rise, where the gradual coastline erosion and the long-term effects like flooding and the displacement is also underestimated, as we perceive that or the already eroded coastline to be the new normal. So this also applies to the weather extremes, where the frequent and the intense storms and the heat waves are perceived to be the new normal. So what are the dangers associated with this shifting baseline syndrome is that we tend to underestimate the urgency of the adequate actions that we have to take against these climate change. So there is an underestimating urgency of action, inadequate adaptation that is taking place, and there is also loss of historical context. So what can be the potential solution to address this problem? It is that we need to have a good track record of the historical data and the climatic records on how it has changed over decades and centuries, and there has to be continuous monitoring, and also we need to prioritize our adaptation based on the previous records. Now let us solve few prelims and mains practice questions. The first question reads, consider the following statements. The LRS allows the resident individuals to remit a certain amount of money abroad with the approval from the RBI. This statement is wrong. India has seen the second highest amount of remittance inflows in the world 2023. This is wrong, as we have seen the first highest amount of remittance. So which of the above statements are correct? One only, two only, both the above statements, and none of the above. As per the options, the answer becomes D. Moving on, the second question is about cholera. Cholera is an acute diarrheal disease caused by the bacterium Vibrio cholerae. Yes, this is correct. It is primarily transmitted through the consumption of water and food contaminated with Vibrio cholerae. This is also correct. And as of now, there is no vaccine available for the prevention of the disease. This is wrong, as we have WHO pre-qualified vaccines. So going by the statement, the right answer will be B. That is only two statements, that is 1 and 2. Moving ahead, the third question reads, consider the following statements. The wholesale price index WPI is considered to calculate the headline inflation in India. No, this is wrong, as the CPI is used to calculate the headline inflation in India. Consumer price index CPI items are majorly represented by industrial inputs. This is wrong. It is majorly by the food inputs. And 2 to 6% is the inflation target, which is the RBI has to realize as a part of its monetary policy. This is correct. So how many of the above given statements is or are correct? Only 1, 2 only, 3 only, and none of the above. So as per the options, the answer will be A. Moving on, the fourth question reads, consider the following provisions of Bharatiya Nagrik Suraksha Sanhita 2023. Introduction of community service as a punishment for minor offences. Yes, correct. Extension of police service to use handcuffs beyond the time of arrest. Correct. Retention of provisions of the police custody up to 90 days beyond the initial 15 days. Correct. And requirements for preventive detention to ensure production before a magistrate within 48 hours. No, this is 24 hours. So which of the statements given above is or are correct? A, 1, 2 and 3 only, 1, 2 and 4 only, 1, 3 and 4 only, and all the above. As per the options, option 4 is wrong. So A, 1, 2 and 3 only. The next question, the concept of shifting baseline syndrome is an environmental studies primarily denotes which of the following? It is nothing but the phenomenon where the gradual environmental changes alter the public perception of what constitutes a normal state. So the answer will be option B. Moving on to the mains practice question. Critically examine the recent legislative reforms in India's criminal justice system with the passage of the Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita Bill 2023 and all the other corresponding bills as well, that is the Bharatiya Nagrik Suraksha as well as Bharatiya Sakshya Bill. So the introduction of this particular question will be introduce the context of Lok Sabha passing the three key bills in order to overhaul India's criminal justice system. And in the body, discuss the significance of such modernization. What is the requirement to shift towards a reformative justice from the punitive justice? Then discuss the concerns such as extensive police custody durations and the bill actually is lacking kind of transparency of the legislative process, etc. And finally, conclude the answer with an overall assessment or the overall impact of these reforms on the India's criminal justice system and its future implications. So that's all with the daily news analysis for today. For regular updates, please like, share and subscribe to Narayana IAS Academy YouTube channel. Thank you.